Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Heleen, for accepting the invitation. So it's our great pleasure to introduce Heleen Slagter, Professor Heleen Slagter, as our final speaker of this semester's seminars, the CCNV seminars. Heleen did her PhD in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Amsterdam, and afterwards, following a postdoc at the Weizmann Center for Brain Imaging at University of Wisconsin-Madison, she came back to Amsterdam, where she was first an assistant and associate professor at UvA, University of Amsterdam, and now she's a professor in the Department of Psychology at the other free university, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam.
Universiteit, yeah.
Yeah, so we have that in common. We have also lots of other things in common, our interest in predictive processing, but also interactions between predictions and other cognitive functions like attention. So this is Heleen's long-standing interest and specialty, and also one of her many contributions to cognitive neuroscience. Another super interesting contribution is the plasticity of the mind in general, but of the predictive mind specifically, and I'm sure we will hear more about that today in the context of meditation and prediction. Heleen is also the recipient of many prestigious grants, including, just naming a couple examples, the VD grant in 2010, the ERC Starting Grant 2015, and the ERC Consolidated Grant in 2021. Yeah, I'm super happy that we could make it. Unfortunately, not in person, but I'm sure that we will have an opportunity to discuss your work nevertheless. Thanks again for accepting the invitation, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. Let me just see. Okay, yeah, this is better. No? Okay. So the focus of my presentation today is on attention and the plasticity of attention. And attention is really one of your most valuable skills because, oh, now the clicker doesn't work. Because what you pay attention to determines what information you have access to, consider and use to act. I have no idea why my mouse doesn't work. Okay, sorry. Our attention determines what we're aware of, and our attention also critically gates new learning. You'll remember little from what a lecturer, for example, or what I'm telling you if you're not paying attention. But as these examples here also illustrate, distraction is paramount. And also many mental disorders are characterized by problems of attention and distraction. So a better understanding of how attention comes about is really very important. So in the field of cognitive neuroscience, we typically define and study attention as a spotlight that we can top-down direct to those aspects of the environment that are relevant to our current goals, thereby determining what information gets processed deeply within the brain and what information remains largely in the dark. But over the past decade or so, it has become clear that what we pay attention to is not just simply driven by our current goals or by salient events in the environment, but that it's also strongly guided by statistical regularities in the environment or learning about predictive structure in the environment. And just to illustrate this, I want to show you some findings from a study by Young et al., where they had participants perform this search task, where they had to find this letter T among a set of rotated L's. And unbeknownst to the participants, what they did was they presented this target, the letter T, more often in one of the 4 search quadrants. And what they found, and what a lot of studies have shown actually before this study, but also since then, is that when you introduce this regularity, that our brains quickly pick up on this and bias attention towards the location where the target is more likely to be found. So what you see here is search times as a function of task block, and you can see that search times are much faster for those trials in which the target occurred in the likely quadrant of the search field compared to the trials where it occurred in any of the other 3 less likely quadrants. So these statistical regularities can induce these strong attentional biases, and very rapidly. But what's really nice about this study is that they subsequently actually took away this regularity. such that now this target could occur equally often again in any of the 4 search quadrants. And what they found was that subjects' attention remained biased towards the quadrant that used to contain the target more often. So in other words, that their attention was insensitive to outcome devaluation. And it's very interesting because insensitivity to outcome devaluation is really a hallmark of habitual behavior. So our brains quickly learn what stimuli are likely informative for goal-directed action, and such learning can express itself as a strong attentional bias that is actually very difficult to extinguish, that's habit-like in nature. So it's also been thought for a long time that just like the brain can top-down prioritize the processing of information that's relevant to our current goals, brains can also top-down inhibit the processing of irrelevant or distracting information. And it has been proposed that alpha band oscillations play a critical role in that, because studies have shown that alpha band activity goes up over sensory regions that represent expected distracting information. However, as has also been pointed out by others, there's in fact actually quite limited evidence in actual support for alpha band oscillations as active top-down inhibition, because the vast majority of studies actually use displays with just 2 stimuli, so bilateral displays. And so foreknowledge about the distractor also automatically entailed knowing something about the target. That may then have caused participants to simply just attend more towards the target, and introduces the possibility that these changes in pre-stimulus alpha band activity that have been linked to top-down inhibition actually reflect attending away, or maybe secondary inhibition related to attending away. But what's more difficult to explain from this perspective is that there's also now a lot of behavioral studies that actually show that it's very difficult to voluntarily, at will, actively suppress distracting information. So these are data from colleagues of mine from the VU, Jan Theeuwis and Ben-Shi Wang, and they had subjects do a visual search task, as is shown here on the left, where participants had to find a unique shape, in this case this green circle. And what then happens is that on about 50% of trials, one of the non-target shapes can take on a unique color. And what many studies have shown is that whenever this so-called singleton distractor is present, it automatically captures your attention and you're much slower in finding the target. And so what they did in this study was present subjects with cues that informed them beforehand about the likely upcoming location of the distractor. And they found that participants could not use this attention directly because their search times were equally slow in trials in which the distractor location was validly cued compared to trials in which it was invalidly cued. So those data seem to suggest that voluntarily at will inhibiting something is very difficult. And this always reminds me of this example of the pink elephant in the room. If I tell you not to attend to it, it's very difficult to do once you have like a mental image of that in your mind. But why I'm also showing these data is because when they simply introduced a regularity such that this singleton distractor could more often occur at one of these search locations, they found that that quickly reduced distractor interference such that search times were much faster whenever the distractor occurred at that high probable location compared to when it occurred at any of the other low probable distractor locations. So it seems that this statistical learning or probabilistic learning is in particular critical to our ability to ignore distracting information. And it's not just about learning to predict the likely distractor location. Also, when participants learn about what a distractor likely looks like, for example, its color, we see that learning actually quickly reduces and can even eliminate attentional capture. So statistical regularities in an environment strongly drive our attention, what we pay attention to, but also what we ignore. And those data really seem to suggest that learning may be a much more inherent feature of how we pay attention to the world around us than is typically thought. So in my talk today, I first want to look at how such statistical learning based in regularities in the environment shapes what we attend to and what we ignore at the neural level. And then in the second part of my talk, I actually want to talk about meditation as a way to actually undo the influence of past learning on how we currently pay attention. But what I mean by that, I'll actually, when we get to the second part of my talk, I'll talk more about that. So how at the neural level does learning from statistical regularities in the environment shape what we attend to and what we ignore? So there's quite some evidence now from EEG and fMRI studies that when goal-relevant stimuli are likely, that actually sharpens or enhances their representation in sensory brain regions that represent that information, in line with this notion that statistical regularities can actually induce these strong attentional biases, even before the stimuli are presented. But learning to predict or learning about what is irrelevant, how that is neurally implemented is less clear. So a few years ago, we actually discussed in this paper several different alternative accounts. So one possibility is that expectations, regardless of whether they concern task relevant or task irrelevant information, sort of are associated with the enhanced representation of the expected information, and if that concerns a distractor, this sharper representation may actually allow the brain to more quickly resolve it after it occurs. But another possibility is that learning what is irrelevant may actually lead to a downweighting of the sense of the populations, the neuronal populations that represent that information, so lead to negative tuning or suppression of activity, and that would then subsequently effectively cancel distractor processing. But yet another possibility is actually that there are no changes in the representation of expected irrelevant information, because why would the brain actively represent something in its activity patterns or actively suppress something? Once it has learned, it can be safely ignored. And in that case, maybe distractor learning relies on other kinds of learning, for example, synaptic plasticity. And so we actually set out to investigate these different possibilities in 3 different EEG studies. Those were spearheaded by my former postdoc, Dirk van Moorselaar. And in these studies, participants performed visual search tasks in which either the target or the distractor became predictable across trials. They were all pre-registered, and we also had strong behavioral effects of our predictability manipulations in all our studies, but I don't really have time to show all of them, so for that I refer you back to these to the published papers. So we were particularly interested to see what would happen before search display onset as a function of learning. And the first thing we did was in all studies was to look at whether we could find any changes in pre-stimulus alpha band activity as a function of distractor location learning. Because what is very interesting about using a visual search task is that if participants, for example, learn that the distractor can more often occur at this particular location, the target can still occur at any of these 6 locations. So learning about the distractor doesn't convey any foreknowledge about the target. And so in this way, we actually better control for this potential confound of attending away. And so what did we find when we looked at changes in pre-stimulus alpha band activity as a function of distractor location learning? Well, in none of the 3 studies, we observed any changes in pre-stimulus alpha band activity, which sort of calls into question further this idea that alpha oscillations are a marker of active, direct, top-down inhibition. But looking at alpha band asymmetry is not a very sensitive measure of how information is represented in the brain. And so we also used different multivariate methods, inverted encoding modeling, but also decoding, to examine more precisely how probabilistic learning may change how distractors and targets are represented. So in the first study, we actually applied inverted encoding modeling. which is a method that allows you to look at to what extent there's actually spatial tuning at the level of populations of neurons to particular locations in space. And so if there is, I don't really have time to go into the methods, but if there is spatial tuning to a particular location, the cortical tuning function has a positive slope. If there's no tuning, it doesn't have a slope. And if there's negative tuning, there's actually a negative going slope. And so that is actually what we looked at. And so I'll show you first the data for the condition in which participants learn to predict the target location. So here we have this cortical tuning slope on the y-axis. And what you can see is that in the green condition, so this was the condition where they could learn to predict where the target was likely going to appear, we can already find enhanced spatial tuning to the target location before search display onset, which we do not see in our baseline condition where there were no participants could not predict where the target may occur, in line with this notion that expectations can sharpen the representation of task relevant information. So what about distractor location learning? Well, actually there we found that learning about where the distractor was likely going to occur did not lead to any changes in anticipatory spatial tuning. It may seem as if there's like a hint of negative tuning, but this was really far from statistically significant. So these findings are more in line sort of with this third scenario, that there are no changes in the representation of a distractor location as a function of statistical learning. And in a sense, this is really strange because we had clear behavioral effects. So at the behavioral level, we really found that learning to predict the distractor location greatly reduces distractor interference. So we also looked at if we could find any differences in how distractors are processed after search display onset. And what we found there in this study, but also in our second EEG study, was that whenever the distractor occurred at the expected or highly probable location, this ERP component called the PD, which in many studies has been associated with reactive inhibition, was greatly reduced in amplitude. So you can see that here, but also here, the PD is virtually gone. And that may suggest that once the brain has learned what information can be safely ignored, there's really no need anymore to really reactively suppress it. But one of the things we were also thinking was, in daily life, when there's like something that's distracting us, it's not like we're just inhibiting some location in space. Typically, we inhibit some object, right? Like a flashing light or a baby that's crying. So the suppression is tied to something, to content. And so in our second study, what we did was that we now also manipulated the extent to which targets and distractors were predictable at the feature level, and specifically at the level of their spatial frequency. And then we used multivariate decoding to see whether distractor feature or target feature learning was associated with changes in the representation of this spatial frequency of this feature information. And so here we see the data again for the condition in which the target spatial frequency was predictable, that's in red, compared to condition in which it was not. And you can see that even before search display onset, we can actually, on the basis of scalp EEG data, decode the target's expected spatial frequency, in line again with this notion that that expected information is more strongly represented in the pattern of brain activity, at least when it's a predictable property of a goal-relevant item. So what about the condition in which the spatial frequency of the distractor was predictable? And in fact, we only had conditions in which the spatial frequency of the distractor was predictable. And in both of them, you can see that we could also decode the predictable spatial frequency of the distractor, which suggests that maybe indeed at the feature level, distracting information that's predictable is also more sharply or more strongly represented by the brain. However, when we ran sort of a test to see to what extent these target and distractor templates were similar in nature, we actually found that the distractor template was different in nature, because when we trained our classifier on spatial frequency, when it was a predictable property of the target, of the distractor. So we tested our classifier on spatial frequency when it was a predictable property of the distractor. And when we then tested it on that same spatial frequency when it was a predictable property of the distractor, we didn't find any generalization. There was actually a bit of a hint of negative decoding. And so this seemed to suggest that the expected spatial frequency was differentially represented as a function of whether it was a feature of the goal relevant or the distracting item. So this may suggest that indeed, at least when it comes down to feature expectations, when they concern distracting or relevant items, that may lead to a relative suppression, but this is very difficult to know on the basis of just multivariate decoding, because it doesn't really tell you anything about the nature of the how do you say that? Or it doesn't tell you anything about the tuning curve, and so we would like to follow up on this with inverted encoding modeling. Okay, just to summarize this first part of my talk. So we've seen that predictions are differentially implemented in the brain as a function of whether they concern information that is relevant to the brain's goals, to our goals, or whether it concerns irrelevant or distracting information. Target expectations were associated with sharpened spatial and feature representations, but for distractor expectations, the story was less clear. We didn't find any evidence for expectation-dependent preparatory spatial suppression, and also no evidence in support of a role for alpha-band oscillations in inhibiting distracting information. But we did find evidence for this distractor feature template, but that was unique to the distractor, and we need to follow up on that to know precisely what the nature of this template is. And then finally, we also observed that learning to ignore was associated with this reduced post-distractor reactive suppression, as indicated by the amplitude reductions of the PD. And so more generally, our findings support this notion that learning is actually a much more pervasive feature of attention than is typically assumed in the lab. And that then raises the question of, how biased or flexible is our attention? How plastic how plastic is our attention? And that actually brings me to the second part of my talk on meditation, because many meditation practices actually involve training of attention. And as such, meditation may actually provide a very valuable tool for studying the plasticity of attention and also of cognition more generally, something that we have put forward in different perspectives over the years. But it's important to point out that many meditation practices do not involve training of regular attention, but actually training of attention in non-regular ways, as non-selective. And in some meditation practices, the idea is actually to drop attention altogether, and actually, in fact, all regular cognition, to drop all regular cognition altogether, to induce a state of awareness of the present moment that is not biased by things that happened in the past or that may happen in the future, or in other words, a state of awareness that is actually unaffected by past learning. And in fact, in Buddhism, meditation is actually seen as a way out of the conditioned existence that we allegedly all live in, according to Buddhist psychology. And so in a recent paper, together with my former postdoc, Ruben Laukonen, who's now an associate professor in Australia, we actually put forward that meditation is not about enhancing attention per se, but rather about unlearning how to attend and respond in habitual ways through modulations of attention. And in this paper, we actually put forward a theoretical framework that to sort of explain these effects of meditation based on the theory of the predictive brain. And so I know this is a lecture series that is all about applications of predictive processing. So many of you are probably familiar with the theory of the predictive brain, but I still want to first take some time to briefly summarize this theory and some of the sort of the major consequences it has about how we think about the human mind, because our theoretical framework of meditation and how meditation may alter attention and thereby also the influence of the past on current experience, I really need to sort of explain this first. So I really hope that those of you who are familiar with this theory just bear with me. So one of the things that we also point out in this paper is that there are actually striking parallels between the theory of the predictive brain and Buddhist psychology, because in both accounts, learning is really a pervasive feature of human mind. And in the theory of the predictive brain, this is a logical consequence of the situation that our brain faces really at every moment of the day, because our brains do not have direct access to the world around us, but only to the electrical signals that are conveyed by the senses. So in other words, the only currency that our brains can work with are their own sensory activation patterns, but the causes of those signals are hidden to the brain. So how then do our brains know what these signals mean? And they have to know this, of course, because they're part of a larger organism that has to sustain itself as a living being in the world and has to interact with the world, and therefore also has to know, of course, what the world looks like. And so the consequence of this situation is, within the theory of the predictive brain, is that our brains must build predictive models based on their experiences and statistical regularities in agent-environment interactions about the likely causes of their sensory input, and then continuously also test their models against the input to ensure reliable models. And so you can see here that in this model building, past experiences become an inherent feature of the way the brain interprets and also detects abilities for interaction in the world. In fact, in this theoretical framework, we move from the traditional notion of perception as a largely stimulus-driven bottom-up process of feature detection and evidence accumulation to a view of perception as a process of top-down inference, in which our brains continuously aim to predict their upcoming sensory input based on predictive structure in the environment and past experiences. And what is then fed up the sensory, what is then fed up the processing hierarchy is not the sensory input, but rather the mismatch between the brain's a priori predictions and the incoming input, or so-called prediction errors, because only prediction errors still contain information or unexplained variance in the sensorium. The whole goal then is to minimize prediction errors to ensure reliable models. But within the theory of the predictive brain, it's not just perception, but actually also action and everything in between that is geared towards minimizing uncertainty or towards minimizing prediction errors. And in the context of action, this provides a very radically different idea of how action comes about compared to how action is traditionally thought to come about as, the result of motor commands that are sent down from motor cortex and the spinal cord to our muscles. Because in this framework of the predictive brain, the idea is that action also comes about through the minimization of sensory prediction errors. That is, the brain expects certain input from the muscles, from proprioceptive input or visual input. And when that input doesn't arrive, there's a prediction error that the brain needs to resolve by moving the arm, by actually generating that input. Or by moving the eyes. And it is hence through action that the brain can actually align the world to itself, so make the world conform with its expectations. I expect to taste an apple. But it's also through action that brains can learn to align themselves to the world, because through active inference, they can actually actively test whether their predictions are actually accurate. And what's also very noticeable about this theory, I find, is that our sense of self is also automatically wrapped into this predictive processing machinery, because to predict how one's own actions will actually change the sensory input, one also has to model themselves as a hidden cause in the world. And so that means that our sense of self is also just a construct of the brain, and in particular a construct that is intimately tied to the minimization of expected surprise, because a living system cannot infer the consequences of its actions unless it embodies a model of the future. And so our sense of self actually simply comes about through, being able, or the necessity to also model the consequences of our own actions. And it's not just perception and action, like I said, but everything in between that is thought or is proposed to come about through prediction error minimization, because our brains are proposed to model the world hierarchically across many different timescales and levels of abstraction, including at levels of the processing hierarchy that are detached from the present environment or the present moment, and that are involved in cognitive processes such as planning and imagery and judging and episodic future thinking. We spend a great deal of our time thinking about things that we're going to do in the future, and how, what we need to do and what potential consequences that can have. But we also think about things that happened in the past, and maybe how, if we had done that, then maybe this would have happened. And so the idea is that also these kinds of more temporally deep cognitive processes can be understood as aiming to minimize uncertainty about the world, but covertly in service of future action, so minimization of prediction errors in the long term. And therefore they have been called mental actions by Thomas Metzinger, that actually engage in counterfactual as-if hypothesis testing. And so there are two consequences I just want to highlight from sort of this framework. First is that the insight seems to come first, because brains must actively create their reality from the inside. Brains continuously predict and interpret the outside world on the basis of their internal models. And this is, I think, always nicely illustrated by the example of tickling. Why cannot you tickle yourself? Well, of course, because you already anticipated the upcoming sensations, tickle sensations, that are therefore no longer surprising and not experienced anymore as tickling. This also actually turns the traditional notion of neuroplasticity on its head. So typically neuroplasticity is defined as the capacity to receive form from the outside. But in the theory of the predictive brain, neuroplasticity is also very much about the capacity to produce form from within. And this is something we actually point out in a recent paper in Frontiers, if you're interested. But it's important to point out that even though, the insight comes first, that doesn't mean that we're just simply, hallucinating the world, or that our perception is an illusion. In fact, what brains must do, of course, is to align themselves as best as possible with their eco-niche. And in that sense, perception is really about fitness and not about truth. A second important consequence that I just want to highlight here is also that in this framework, learning is a pervasive feature of all mental activity, because all mental activity is constructed through predictive models that have previously come to reliably reduce errors in prediction. In other words, our mental landscape is dominated by predictions that have reliably reduced uncertainty in the past. And that this is the case for perception, I think, is always very nicely illustrated by the hello face mask illusion. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this illusion, but what you see here is a hello mask rotating around its axis. And just when you think you can see the inside of the face, suddenly it just flips back outward and looks straight at you. I don't know if you can see that on your screen, but it's a striking illusion, and there are actually two causes why it's very difficult to see the inside of the face, or impossible for most people. Well, one of them is, of course, that the inside of a face is not really a likelihood in the outside world. We rarely encounter faces from the inside in our daily lives, because faces are attached to heads, obviously. But the other thing that contributes to this illusion is that we've also learned over the course of our lifetime that light typically falls from above. And also therefore that shadows are cast in a specific way, and the way the shadowing falls on the inside of the face actually makes it appear convex, so extending outward. But the idea is also that repeating certain thoughts and behaviors actually can carve valleys, valleys, is that the right word? Yeah, valleys in our mental landscape. This is a process that has been dubbed canalization recently by Card, Harris, and Friston. So that, you know, if you think in certain ways and you do that often enough, actually, that will actually carve specific valleys in your mental landscape that actually sort of create or actually make it so that also in the future you're more likely to think or behave in those past ways. And of course, you know, a mind grounded in past experience is very adaptive because it allows us, you know, to live, live successfully in the world. But it can also be maladaptive, for example, if the environment changes or when these valleys are too deeply carved. And so our predictive models must be flexible to some extent, and there must be this balance between the internal or the influence of past learning and the external or the influence of new learning. And that actually brings me to attention. So obviously our brains, obviously it would be detrimental if our brains would simply be at the whim of the external world. So whenever a prediction error occurs, that they would have to revise their internal models because the world is full of statistical noise and incoming input is not always representative of the larger world. And so brains also have to estimate statistical volatility, or in other words, predict the reliability or precision of sensory evidence. So they do not only have to estimate the upcoming sensory input, but also its reliability or precision, which is a second order prediction. And as Friston put it, there are only two sorts of things that need to be inferred about the world: the state of the world and uncertainty about that state. And I think a very nice example is the following, like, you know, when you use the bathroom at night and your red chair looks orange, it's very unlikely that you think your red chair is suddenly orange because, you know, the sensory input is treated as low definition and noisy, not precise. And so precision weighting is a way to ensure that only prediction errors with high expected precision, that the brain estimates to provide reliable, high quality sensory information, can revise or update predictive models. And this provides the brain with this mechanism to control the relative influence of top-down prediction, so past learning, versus bottom-up input or new learning in a context-sensitive manner. Sorry. So it has been proposed that it's actually attention that maps onto precision weighting, because there are many empirical studies that show that attention can actually up or down regulate the amplitude of sensory responses, in line with this notion that precision weighting can up or down regulate the size of prediction errors. And what I find very interesting about this proposal is that it automatically ties in learning into attention. Because if you have to estimate the precision or the variance of prediction errors, you automatically have to integrate across experiences. And this also sort of aligns well with the first part of my talk, where I actually showed that predictive learning leads to more precise sensory representations or predictions, but only of those objects that the brain considers reliable or informative for goal-directed information, for goal-directed action. And in a recent study, this is a bit of a detour, but very quick, we actually manipulated the volatility of search context, because the idea is that in more volatile environments, brain should be slower to pick up on predictive structure, because the input should be assigned less precision. And this is also what we found. We found that participants only learned to ignore a predictable distractor when it occurred in a more limited set of search environments. And we also wrote a little commentary a few years ago in which we actually discussed the attentional capture literature from the perspective of predictive processing. So if you're interested in that, I also refer you to that paper. Okay, so just to, well, I'm not going to summarize this. I guess I made these points, but one of the things, of course, that comes out of this is that, you know, in the predictive processing framework, our mental landscape is dominated by models that have reliably reduced uncertainty in the past. So learning is this pervasive feature of the human mind. And that then, of course, raises this question, you know, how plastic is the predictive mind? And that then brings me back to meditation and to our paper, in which we actually discuss these striking parallels between the theory of the predictive brain, but also how in Buddhist psychology one thinks about the mind. And in particular, how meditation is actually seen as a way to sort of deconstruct the mind from within, because also here the idea is that reality is created within the mind, to reduce the influence of past experiences so that you can experience things anew, no longer wholly determined by acquired mental habits. And so what we specifically propose in this paper is that certain meditation practices can gradually bring the practitioner more and more into the present moment, so unaffected by past learning, or being directed at the future, by progressively abating hierarchical, temporally deep predictive processing, and that this happens through changes in precision weighting in attention. So let me just unpack that a little bit for you. We actually put forward that three main styles of meditation can be placed on a continuum that gradually break down the influence of past learning on current experience: focused attention meditation, open monitoring meditation, and non-dual awareness meditation. And these are umbrella terms, and there are also many other meditation practices that don't really fall under these umbrella terms. But these are three main styles of meditation that occur basically in the three main Buddhist traditions, so Zen meditation, or Zen Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, and also Tibetan Buddhism. And so focused attention meditation is probably something that most of you are familiar with. It's a concentrative style of meditation where you simply have to focus your attention on a particular object, and often that's the sensations of breathing. And the idea is that you focus your attention there, and whenever you notice your mind wandering, you just simply bring your attention back to that object. And so from a predictive processing perspective, you could say that during focused attention meditation, you actually increase the expected precision of one source of present moment sensory experience, breathing sensations, which then should automatically reduce the precision that is assigned to anything else that could occur in experience, for example, habitual trains of thoughts that may arise. And because they're assigned less precision, there should also be less automatic grasping onto these other mental processes that may arise. And eventually, with a lot of practice, may actually also reduce their frequency or even prevent them from arising altogether. And so you can see here that we should get a shift from more temporally deep thinking to just present moment sensing. And so typically, once someone has become a little bit more familiar with this style of meditation, one moves on to the second style of meditation, open monitoring meditation, which actually has many features of secular mindfulness as it is practiced in the West. And here one actually drops the object of attention to induce a form of, you could say, non-selective or bare attention, where one is just simply taking note of whatever arises in experience, be it a sensation, a thought, or a feeling, but without judgment or evaluation. And so this style of meditation, you could say, induces the state of non-reactive awareness or bare attention, which is non-selective in nature, is just open to whatever may occur in experience. And so from a predictive processing perspective, you could say that in this state of mind, any content of experience is assigned equal precision and consequently very low precision in relative terms. And so with more practice, as non-judgmental observing increases, the idea is that you get a shift to sort of a mode of experiencing that has also been called pure sensing, or pure experiencing, which is conceivably temporally prior to evaluations of the sensory experience. And one of the examples that is often given is that people who are in a meditation retreat, they have to sit still for extended periods of time, which can actually induce pain in the knees and in the back, and that can actually be excruciating. But at some point, one actually realizes that that the sensations in the knees or back actually occur prior to the evaluation or the experiencing of them as pain. And then actually this painful sensation can also just be dropped. So open monitoring meditation sort of induces a mode of experiencing that you could say is at an earlier or less temporally deep level of the hierarchy, so closer to whatever is happening in the now, in the present moment. And so then the third style of meditation, non-dual awareness meditation, that's a style of meditation that is less familiar to people and also practiced less often. And this is a style of meditation where one aims to discover an awareness that is really unchanging regardless of what happens in experience. So people have called it the ground of all experience, against which basically anything arises, including sensing. And so in FA and OM, there's always an observer observing something still, even if it is pure sensing. So there's still this duality inherent in the practice. But from the perspective of non-dual discovery, this duality between subject and object is also a concept or a conceptual model that is constructed from past experience. And this may sound very vague, but I think this example of the teacup actually illustrates this very nicely, because just experiencing this teacup actually involves quite a complex process of construction from past experience. I mean, you know this is a teacup because you've interacted with them in the past. And it's not just that, you also sort of are able to anticipate a range of possible futures, including, the anticipation of possible changes in sensory input, for example, related to drinking the cup. And we know that anticipating potential outcomes of potential actions, in a sense, intrinsically also ties in the sense of self within the predictive processing framework. And it's interesting because the same thing is said in Buddhist psychology, that objects and subjects always arise together in experience. And so the idea is that in this style of meditation, any abstraction away from the here and now, so even very temporally shallow predictions related to sensing, conceptualization, are actually let go. And there are different ways to sort of induce this, but one of them is, for example, by realizing that subject and object always arise together in experience, so that there's not a separate self. And then the idea is that this induces a state of non-dual or pure awareness, in which the sense of self is actually completely disappeared, but also the sense of time. And this sort of makes sense because if you're really resting awareness in this moment, this moment is no longer situated with respect to past moments or, a future moment in time. And then also the experience of timelessness is like a logical consequence. All right, so that was our theory of meditation within the predictive processing framework. Where we propose that what meditation does is bring somebody more and more into the present moment by gradually reducing temporally deep hierarchical predictive processing through changes in precision weighting or how one pays attention. And we put forward that this can not only explain changes in regular cognition, such as an enhanced ability to sustain attention or reduced mind wandering, but that it can also explain some more esoteric aspects of meditation, including ultimately the emergence of a state of selfless, timeless awareness. And just to bring this back to sort of where we started, this account may also explain the positive effects of meditation outside of the meditative context, because the idea is that during the meditative state, by assigning less precision to processes that are naturally or habitually evoked or that habitually just dominate our mental landscape, habitual ways of attending and thinking and responding are weakened. And this should open up the mental landscape outside of the meditative context, so enhance cognitive flexibility. Or in other case, unlearning is really a main feature of meditation. And we also put forward in our paper that our framework can also explain more negative effects of meditation, such as enduring distortions in sense of self, because also along sort of these three meditation styles, different aspects of our sense of self are gradually broken down. And it could be that a meditator just gets wrapped into a wrong model, you could say, of self that's actually very dysfunctional in daily life. Okay, I see that I'm not doing so good on time. So can I take 5 more minutes? Is that good? Or how? Yeah, okay. I see a thumbs up and nodding. Okay, so in our paper, we also discuss some evidence for our theory. There's some indeed studies that suggest that meditation can enhance the ability to sustain attention and reduce mind wandering. It should be noted, though, that it's very difficult to do scientifically rigorous meditation research because it's impossible to blind meditators towards the fact that they're actually participating in a meditation study. So you always have to be wary of potential confounding contributions from placebo effects or demand characteristics. But in any case, so I don't have time to go over sort of the empirical evidence, but I do want to show you some findings from a study that I did many years ago now already, when I was still a postdoc actually, that actually are very interesting from the idea that meditation can actually enhance one's ability to be in the present moment unaffected by what just happened. Because what we did there was we looked at the effects of people going into a 3-month meditation retreat where they practiced a style of open monitoring meditation called Vipassana meditation. And before and after the retreat, we had them do an attentional blink task. And this attentional blink task, I don't know if you guys know it, but what you have to do is you have to detect 2 targets in a very rapid stream of non-targets, because you have to report them at the end of the sequence. And the common observation is whenever this first target follows the first one very quickly in time, within half a second, you often don't see it, you miss it. And the idea is that you miss the second target because your attention got stuck on the first target stimulus. So back then I didn't know much about meditation, but when I was told that this style of meditation induces this form of non-reactive present moment awareness, I thought, well, if people do that for 3 months, for 10 to 12 hours per day, they should, attentional responding to the first target should be reduced, allowing them to sort of see the second target more often. And indeed, compared to the control group, that's precisely what we found. We found that the second target was more often seen, and actually at the neural level, we also found that this was actually associated with a reduction in higher order processing or attentional clinging to the first target stimulus, as measured by a drop in the amplitude of the T1 evoked P3B, which is an ERP component of higher order target processing. I'm just going to skip over this. And so that's some evidence that open monitoring meditation may reduce reacting to stimuli and thereby increasing present moment awareness. So one of the things we're doing now in the lab is trying to develop no report paradigms, because one of the things that's really difficult, of course, is that, when people are in deep meditative states that should radically change sort of the predictive activity of the brain, you cannot ask them to perform computerized tasks, because as soon as they have to do tasks and press buttons, that will actually take them out of the state, because then they have to engage in active inference. And decision-making and judging and all these sorts of things. And so one of the things we're doing now, and I'd hope to show you some results, but data collection just started, we developed a no-report binocular rivalry paradigm, and binocular rivalry is really interesting because what you see is that when you present each eye to a different stimulus, for example, left eye face, right eye house, is that rather than seeing a mixed percept, like a mixed face house percept, the brain either sees the face or it sees the house. And from the predictive processing perspective, this actually makes sense because we know that two objects cannot occupy the same location in space and time. So there's this hyperprior against that possibility, but also we rarely encounter merged face house stimuli. So that's also really an unlikelihood. So the brain settles on explaining one of the percepts, the face, but then the incoming input from the other eye, the house information, triggers a prediction error that the brain then needs to explain. And so it starts alternating between these two percepts. And there's some evidence from a study from 2005 from Olivia Carter, where they found that monks in the Himalayas that were engaging in one-point meditation, which involves maintaining focus of attention on a single object, actually self-reported that they could keep one of these percepts very stable in their mind for extended periods of time. But if you read the supplements of this paper, actually all of them reported on this. Almost all of them reported on this after the experiment. And so it's unclear whether what they reported was actually true, and also to what extent their reports were actually accurate, because how do you know that you were able to keep a percept stable for 37 seconds if you report on it, 15 minutes later? And so we have actually developed a binocular rivalry paradigm where we use scalp EEG and flickering stimuli in each eye to sort of track what percept is in the mind's eye, because these flickering stimuli actually trigger activity at the level of the scalp in specific frequency bands. And we show that, what percept you have in your mind actually is associated with the higher power at that flicker frequency. And so we actually looked at the extent to which our method for sort of looking on the basis of flicker rate, what percept was in a person's mind to determine their switch rate was actually associated with their self-reported switch rate. And we found a very strong correlation of 0.94. And so this seems to suggest that we can use this now as a no-report paradigm to look at what happens during different meditative states to the brain's ability to either keep a percept stable as in FA, or maybe in OM when there's like a non-selective mode, maybe what will happen is actually that the two images will fuse more often. And so this is actually something we're currently testing. Okay, so we talked about learning and attention and also about unlearning through meditation. What you pay attention to is not just fundamental to your current mental life, but it can also affect how you pay attention in the future. So attention is really in that sense maybe your most valuable skill. And with that, I want to thank all the people that contributed to these ideas and the work that I presented here today, in particular Ruben Laukonen and Dirk van Moorselaar, and of course also you for your learned attention. Thank you.